Hello, lovely ladies. I'm sad that I can't see you in person, but hopefully you'll enjoy this lesson as much as I did. The lesson is the American Civil War, Slavery, and the Pioneers. So we're going to go through sort of a little bit of a Black history, include some famous people that most of you have probably heard of, and then just talk a little bit about their journey through the church's history. So before the Civil War, Utah was considered a slave territory, and that meant that slavery was allowed within its borders. But on February 15th, 1851, Orson Hyde, he made the following statement about slavery. So I'm just going to read that to you. So bear with me. We feel it to be our duty to define our position in relation to the subject of slavery. There are several men in the valley of the Salt Lake from the southern states who have their slaves with them. There is no law in Utah to authorize slavery, neither any to prohibit it. If the slave is disposed to leave his master, no power exists there, either legal or moral, that will prevent him. But if the slave chooses to remain with his master, none are allowed to interfere between the master and the slave. All the slaves that are there appear to be perfectly contented and satisfied. And then he continued with this. When a man in the southern states embraces our faith and is the owner of slaves, the church says to him, if your slaves wish to remain with you and to go with you, put them not away. But if they choose to leave you or are not satisfied to remain with you, it is for you to sell them or to let them go free as your own conscience may direct you. The church on this point assumes not the responsibility to direct. The laws of the land recognize slavery. We do not wish to oppose the laws of the country. If there is sin in selling a slave, let the individual who sells him bear that sin and not the church. Wisdom and prudence dictate to us this position, and we trust that our position will be henceforth understood. So we can kind of see how the church is feeling about slavery. A lot of people at that time did have slaves as they brought them into the Utah territory. Now we're moving into the Civil War. So we've got the effects of the Civil War going on. We've got this war between slavery and non-slavery. We've got the North versus the South. And it did affect a lot of the immigrants. And I never thought of this. So you're coming from Europe and you hit the United States where there's this civil war, this unrest. How do you get across the plains in the midst of a war? And I, for some reason, had never really put that together, right? That they had to find alternate routes to get to Salt Lake City. So we had people rerouting on the ocean and we had people rerouting on land. Some people had to go up through Canada and around, up north and around and come back down. But let's talk a little bit about how some of those people were treated on their routes across the United States. So you had there's a boat called the Hudson, and it was carrying 863 saints, and it was hailed or stopped by this gunboat named Georgia. And the captain of the Hudson, who was carrying all these saints, he reported that he was carrying 1,100 English immigrants. Then the officers of the gunboat realized they couldn't accommodate that many prisoners of war, so they let them go. So I guess you needed to find really crowded ships so that you wouldn't be tossed in with the prisoners of war. So there were boats, and now you had your trains. Trains were also stopped. A lot of the Union soldiers would stop the trains and they would look for deserters. They would look for people to stop. So you had, they were trying to stop the slavery issue. So they were trying to free any Black people that they saw along the way. And it said, those who traveled by rail through Missouri could expect their trains to be fired upon. The demands of war reduced the number of cars available for civilian travelers, and many saints were forced to travel in overcrowded boxcars. So now traveling by train doesn't seem very appealing to a lot of these saints. They don't want to get shot at. It's a very precarious time for them. And then you have people who are experiencing the same kind of problems going by steamboat. So here we have boats were super overcrowded, just like the trains, and then they were stopped as well. And this, as we're talking about the Civil War, I think it's appropriate to bring up the prophecy that Joseph Smith made in Doctrine and Covenants, section 87. It said, verily thus saith the Lord concerning the wars that will shortly come to pass, beginning at the rebellion of South Carolina, which will eventually terminate in the death and misery of many souls. Wow. And even during this time, it's estimated that more than 17,000 saints still arrived in the Salt Lake Valley during that Civil War era. They also changed the way that they were having people come back and forth having people come to the Salt Lake Valley. They had this out and back plan. So they would hire teamsters to help the saints come across. And so the saints didn't have to buy the oxen and the horses and the wagons and things. So they didn't have them as their property when they got to the Salt Lake Valley. And then people would go back to the settlements and they'd gather more saints and travel across. So you didn't have to buy all these supplies. It was a much better way to get the saints, much cheaper way to get the saints across through Nebraska and so forth. So it was much more cost effective that way. Okay, so I want to focus most of our time on the wonderful families that either had slaves or the slaves themselves. In this case, it's not a slave. It is Jane Elizabeth Manning James. I think many of you have heard of her. There's the movie that has come out, Emma and Jane. This is Jane Manning. So let me give you a little bit of history. Jane Elizabeth Manning, she was born May 11th, 1813 in Connecticut. She was blessed never to be a slave, but she was Black. So she felt the prejudice, and she felt how people treated her because of her skin color. She worked alongside her parents on a farm of a wealthy white man in Connecticut, and there she met the Mormon missionaries. So she embraced their teaching. She was baptized at the same time as several of her family members. She was excited to embrace the gospel. And when the church counseled people to move to Illinois, they wanted to go with them. So they gathered up their things and they wanted to book passage on a boat and to carry them about 800 miles to the destination, to Illinois. And Jane and her family were refused passage aboard the boat because of their color. So they were forced off of the boat. They couldn't even get on. They had their belongings. As far as I can tell, their belongings were actually put on the boat, so they didn't ever get them back. Just a lot of things happened. And so they were forced to go by foot to Illinois. And here is a little experience that Jane wrote in her journal. She said, "We walked until our shoes were worn out and our feet became sore and cracked open and bled until you could see the whole print of our feet with blood on the ground. We stopped and united in prayer to the Lord. We asked God, the Eternal Father, to heal our feet, and our prayers were answered and our feet were healed forthwith. We went on our way rejoicing, singing hymns and thanking God for his infinite goodness and mercy to us in blessing us, protecting us, and healing our feet." Wow, right? What miraculous faith these wonderful Black saints had. And they also, during this time, they were fearful of appearing to be runaway slaves because there were a lot of slaves running away from their masters. And at one time, they were stopped by some people and they demanded to see their free papers. And they were threatened to be put in jail if they didn't produce their documents. And finally, they were able to convince the authorities that they didn't have these papers because they were born free. They didn't have to have papers saying that they were free because they were born free. And they were let go. So they were persecuted, they were hungry, they were only prepared for that boat trip that would take such a short time compared to walking there. So they had to search for shelter and food along the way, and many people would not take in Black individuals or families. So they did not receive a lot of that much needed assistance. And upon their arrival in Nauvoo, they were taken directly to the home of Joseph Smith. And he just marveled at their faith and perseverance. Joseph Smith pronounced a blessing upon the family, commending Jane for her leadership and giving these assuring words: "God bless you. You are among friends. Now you will be protected." Wow, just think about how that would feel, being persecuted, having all these trials and everything, and suddenly being welcomed with open arms amongst the saints. I just thought that was really, really touching, and I hope that we have that same view today. So Jane then became a live-in servant for Emma and Joseph Smith. She became a trusted friend, a confidant to Emma, just a really great asset to their family. Then in 1845, she married Isaac James. He was a free black man from New Jersey. He was a member of the church as well, and he was 11 years younger than she was. And when they left for the Salt Lake Valley, they had, they had with them Jane's son Sylvester, as well as Jane and Isaac's infant son Silas. And then after a time, they arrived in the Salt Lake Valley. Jane had 6 more children while living in the Salt Lake area, and the young parents really struggled to feed their growing family as they established themselves in the Salt Lake Valley in their new home. And in 1870, Isaac left the family. He walked out on them. So Jane had to manage their crops. She had to manage their family. She's got several children at this point. So she took in laundry, she made homemade soap, everything to sustain herself and her children. And she also managed to donate to those less fortunate around her, which I think is just astounding. There was this story of the wife of Amasa Lyman, Eliza Lyman, and she said that her husband had to leave and they were down to the last of their flour. They had just used the last of their flour, and Jane comes over with a bag of flour, and it happened to be 2 pounds of flour, and that was half of what Jane had left to give to this family that had nothing left. So that was kind of the idea that Jane was very generous, a very giving woman, always ready to help and serve. Let's see. Okay, so remember, Isaac James, her husband, he had left. 20 years goes by and he returns. What would you do? He's been gone, you have no idea where he's been, and he comes back asking for forgiveness. And she did. She forgave him. And not only that, she took care of him as he was dying. Isaac died on November 19th, 1891, just 1 year after returning to his family. She was there to take care of him. So Jane, after that, lived another 17 years, and she was just known as a respected matriarch of the Black community in Utah. She became blind in her later years, and she eventually had a fall, which sort of led to a decline in her health, and she ended up passing away from complications of that fall. And at that time of her death on April 16th, 1908, Jane had already outlived 6 of her 8 children. She was lovingly cared for by her brother, Isaac Manning, who was 2 years younger than she was. And it just talks a lot about their strong family bond. You know, Isaac and Jane had walked together across the plains. They traveled together. They served in the Joseph Smith home together. They had that special bond, and he ended up taking care of her on her dying days. I thought that was really neat. And it says, it just gave a really cute description of her funeral, and I'll just end with Jane Manning with this. President Joseph F. Smith was a speaker at the funeral. Jane Elizabeth Manning James, pioneer of 1847, mother, friend, humanitarian, and courageous defender of her faith, was laid to rest in the Salt Lake City Cemetery on April 21st, 1908. Okay, so that's Jane Manning, a great matriarch in the Black community of the Saints. Now I'm going to tell you a story about a man named Gobo Fango. Gobo Fango. He was born in South Africa, and there's this whole story about this tribe in South Africa and these trials that they went through and everything. Long story short, this Gobo Fango was 3 years old when his mother sought refuge at the home of a couple. Their names were Henry and Ruth Talbot. So this mom took her son to their family, and before her death, Gobo's mother left him in the care of the Talbot family, who ended up taking care of him. Missionaries come, so keep in mind this, the Talbots were white South Africans, Gobo Fango was a black South African. And they adopted him. They treated him like one of their own. They met the missionaries and they became, they were baptized in 1857, and by 1861 they were making their way to join the Saints in the Salt Lake Valley. Now keep in mind, 1861, we're back to the Civil War, right? We've come kind of full circle. Now we're back to the Civil War, and you have this white family trying to bring their family, including a little white boy, across the plains. But first, they have to get on a ship. So let me read this little part. Let's see, though the Civil War had just begun and slavery was still legal in the United States, it was illegal to transport slaves from Africa. Remember, they're from South Africa. So the family did not want to leave Gobo in Africa, yet they would be accused of being involved in the slave trade if they were to take him. The decision was made to wrap Gobo Fango in a roll of carpet and carry him on board the Racehorse, the ship which would carry the Talbot family to Boston Harbor in the United States. By this time, Gobo was 6. So Gobo was free to roam the ship as they sailed and proved to be a delightful entertainer and hard worker. When the Talbot family arrived in Boston, they had to once again conceal the young boy. Some reports say that he was hidden under Ruth's hoop skirts, while others say he was dressed as a little girl wearing a bonnet to conceal both his gender and dark skin. Whatever the case is, he did make it safely with them to the Utah Territory, arriving in September 1861. They were in the Homer Duncan Company. And this is kind of cool. The family settled in Kaysville, Davis County, Utah, so right here. And Gobo worked as a laborer. His feet became severely frostbitten once when he was tending cattle out on the plains, and they said, well, we need to cut off your foot. And he said no, he didn't want that to happen. So they ended up cutting off part of his heel, and he would shove newspaper and things in his shoe so the shoe would stay on and that he wouldn't have such a limp when he walked. And he also worked as a laborer in Grantsville, Utah, for a woman named Mary Ann Whitesides Walker and her family for about 10 years, from 1870 to 1880. And then after 1880, he moved to Goose Creek, Idaho, and he went into business with a couple of men herding sheep. And in this area of Idaho, there was kind of a feud going on between the sheep herders and the cattlemen with the cows. And the grazing land was actually supposed to be open to anyone wanting to graze. And the cattlemen said the sheep cut the grass too short and their hooves tear up the dirt, and we got there first, so you can't invade our lands. And the sheep herders are like, we just need food and water for our sheep, right? So they were having this feud, and unfortunately Gobo Fango was caught in the middle of that feud. On his deathbed, he wrote out what happened in his last moments. He said, I was herding sheep about 3 or 4 miles from Bedke's ranch in Little Basin about 9 o'clock in the morning, February 7th. Bedke and another man came up on horses, and Bedke ordered me to move off that part of the range. I refused to go unless he could show me a patent for the land. So Bedke came and said, this is my land, you need to move. And he's like, I'm not going to move unless you show me that you really do own this land. He said, I will show you the patent. I said, I would like to see it. He got off his horse, his partner holding him. He came up to me, knocked the gun out of my hands, pulled out a derringer, and shot me over the left eye. I fell, and as I tried to get up, he knocked me down with the derringer. I then said, I will get even with you, Mr. Bedke. He then said, you black, bad word, I will kill you. Then fired another shot into me. His partner then said, let him alone. And Bedke said, no, I will kill him right here. He then shot me again, and I knew no more. When I came to, I heard Bedke say, he won't go far, he will die right there. Then got up after they, and then Gobo Fango got up after they was out of sight and walked a distance of 4 miles to Walter Matthews' house. So that's Gobo Fango's version of the story. And now we have the story that's handed down in the Bedke family from what happened on that same day. Here's how their story goes. The Bedke family tells the story differently, claiming that Frank Bedke was on his way to a family gathering when he felt prompted to check on the northwest area of his property. Sending his wife ahead, promising to catch up with her later, he and a friend proceeded to the area. As he and his friend Jay Caulfield surveyed the land, they noticed sheep grazing within the protected 2-mile radius. They located the sheep camp in the early afternoon, and as they approached, Gobo, armed with a rifle, jumped out of the brush in front of Bedke's horse, demanding, "Are you Bedke?" To which Frank responded, "Yes." Bedke was then ordered to leave. At this demand, Frank spurred his horse to turn to leave, causing the horse to jump toward Gobo Fango, causing him to fall. As Gobo lay on the ground, Bedke dismounted his horse and attempted to disarm Gobo. As the two wrestled for the gun, it discharged, hitting Gobo in the neck. Frank Bedke then instructed Cafield to go tell his wife what had happened. Bedke left for Albion to report the accidental shooting to the sheriff. While the two accounts, so that's the Bedke account, right? So we have Gobo Fango and we have Bedke. Very different accounts, but there are two things that are similar in both accounts. They are Gobo Fango was shot by Frank Bedke, and that the two men left him alone miles from help. And obviously Gobo Fango then died of his injuries after that. It talks about the trial of the murder, and Frank Bedke was acquitted, and they speculate that perhaps Frank Bedke's influential position in the community probably intimidated the jury, plus you have his word against the word of a black man. And so everything sort of went against Gobo Fango, and he stood little chance of being treated fairly. I thought this was really sweet. Gobo Fango dictated a will before passing that included the following instructions. He wanted his body decently buried with proper regard to my station and condition in life and the circumstances of my estate. He also requested that his funeral expenses be paid, money given to friends, as well as to the needy people in Grantsville, and the rest of his estate, which amounted to about $400, be given to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, to be used toward the building of the Salt Lake Temple. Gobo Fango is buried in the Oakley, Idaho cemetery, and there was never a record of him ever getting married or having children. So a very different outcome for one of the black immigrants. Go through,